Good morning, guys. Just wanted to continue this morning, sort of in our series on the newness of life. It's the month of April, so we're doing a little bit of a focus four-part series on Jesus and sort of who he was, what he did, and why he came. And over the last couple of weeks, we've taken a look at specifically who is Jesus, you sort of looked specifically at the humility of Jesus and how that's really set up as a model for us in our lives. And then we looked at why he came. Why was it even necessary that Christ would come to the earth and be born as a baby and live an actual life as fully man and fully God. And then today I just want to look at sort of like if it was important for him to come, and the why is like we needed saving. I think for many of you, maybe if you're anything like me, it's like how does that save me? How does the death of one man serve to completely wipe away my sin? How does that save me? And so this morning I want to look at two scripture verses. Really, I want to land in Isaiah 53, 4-6. I think that is for me just a very clear image of sort of the how of Christ. Like, how in the world does his sacrifice do anything for me? And then we'll flip over to 2 Corinthians in a second. But I want to read Isaiah 53 to you. This is verses 3-6. Isaiah 53. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now listen to this in verse 4. Surely he, meaning Christ, has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement. So check this. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his stripes, so his being whipped, we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And so sort of the why question, or the how question for us is, how does Christ taking our chastisement, right? Him taking our death, give us life, right? What do we gain from his death? And how does that work? And I think the analogy I always like to use is if somebody broke into my home today, right? And they stole a bunch of things, and I caught them on video, and then we were able to find them and arrest them, and they were caught red-handed with all the things that they had stolen. And then we went to the judge, we went to court, and the judge said, hey, yeah, you're guilty. You have been found guilty. We've got sufficient evidence to show your guilt. It's 100% positive you're guilty, but I'm just going to let you off because I know your heart. Like that, I think me personally, think about if you were in those shoes, or be more extreme than just stealing some things. So you kill somebody, I'm just going to let you off because I know your heart, right? We would be mad at that judge. That judge would be an unjust judge. There's a punishment that has to be paid. There's retribution that must be made for a crime. And I think that judge would be ridiculed and be not deemed a just judge at all. And yet we want we want God to be that kind of judge. Yeah, I know you sinned against me. Yeah, I know you did all these terrible things. Yes, I know you were, like it says in Isaiah 53, right? You were like sheep gone astray, each to your own way. Yes, I get it, but I know your heart, so you're fine, right? We want God to be that judge that we would despise so much if it were in a different situation. And that's just the reality, is God can't be that judge. He is a just, holy, righteous God. The Bible is clear that he can't be anything but those things. The nature of who God is holy and just and righteous. And that lends him to the ability to be merciful and gracious. But those two things have to work together. And so God is looking, you have to imagine that God is looking on us, right? This is straight out of Romans, right? He sees us as really rebels, right? We're the ungodly. We are all going our own way, Isaiah 53. And he sees us and he says, yeah, They deserve death. Romans 6:23, for the penalty of sin is death, right? We deserve death. We talked about why last week. Why does Christ have to come at all? Because we deserve death. And so he really has two options here. He can, I guess he has as many options as he wants. He's God. But because he's just and righteous, he has only really a couple options. And all of them end with somebody being punished for the sin of man. And so he could give us exactly what we deserve, right? Like he could be the God that just is completely right and completely good to let us get exactly what we desire, and that is separation from him, right? Like think about Romans 1. They desired the created rather than the creator, right? We desired earthly things that are vanity instead of the God who created earthly things. He may just let us have exactly what we want, and he would be 100% right in doing that, to give me, Spencer Arnold, exactly what I want, which is all of these earthly things, and yet separation from him. And so what would I get in eternity? Is separation from him. Right, so he'd be absolutely right to let me have that. But in Isaiah 53, it's clear, like, I've gone astray, I've turned to my own way. That's what I'm chasing, right? Yet the Lord isn't content to let me receive the due penalty for my iniquity, even though he'd be right in doing that, right? Ephesians 2:4 says, but God being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead, right? Even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. So he was not content to see us drown in our iniquity and in our mire and in our death and in our sin. And so he couldn't take that option because of it, according to Ephesians 2, because of his grace and his mercy and his kindness. And so we see this like necessity to be right on the one hand and just on the one hand. And then we see this desire for grace and mercy on the other. And so how does God solve this tension, this conundrum he's in, right? Well, he's God. He solves it the way that is best. And he sent his son to die the death we deserve, right? The due just penalty. So there is still this debt that has to be paid. Somebody has to pay the debt. Look at all of the Old Testament. We see when they sin, something dies, right? When there's an uncleanliness in the camp because of sin of the people, something is sacrificed, and the blood serves as the punishment. And it's not just any blood. We talked about this in Leviticus 15 in a previous devotional. It's an unblemished, perfect lamb. That is the history of the Old Testament. That's a history of God's interaction with people. Is that there's a problem, right? Like there is a sin that has to be accounted for. There's something that has to be paid for. Just like a good, just judge must lay down the right retribution for the crime. Well, the right retribution for my sin is my death. And yet, God says, but God, right? He sends Christ. How does Christ save me? Well, how is easy? He takes my death and I get his righteousness, right? This is where we go back to Isaiah 53. How does Christ save me? Well, he's wounded for my transgressions. I'm going to replace our with my here. He's crushed for my iniquities, right? Upon him was the chastisement, my problem, my sin that brought me peace, right? With his stripes, Christ's stripes, with his pain, his death, his suffering, I'm healed, right? I like sheep have gone astray, gone my own way, and the Lord has laid on Christ my iniquity, my death, my suffering, my due just penalty laid on Christ. Surely he has borne my grief. He's carried my sorrows, right? I esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted, but he was wounded for my transgressions. How? He took what I deserved, and he gave me what was only his. And that's the greatest news we could have ever heard. That he took, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says that he was perfect. I'm going to read this exactly to you so I don't mess it up. I used to have this one memorized. I'm going to blame that on kids. Right, that's it. Isn't that what parents do when they don't do something right? They just blame it on their kids. I'm just kidding. In 2 Corinthians 5:21 it says, and I can't get there fast enough, it says that essentially that Christ took, here we go, let's just read it. 5:21. So 5:21 is one of the best examples of the how here. And it says in 5:21 that for our sake, so for my sake, for the sake of man, He made him, Christ, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. For my sake, Christ became my sin, so that in him, in my belief and by faith alone in him, I might gain or might become the righteousness of God. So the how question is easily answered and not easily understood. The how is easy. Christ took on him my punishment. So the judge, God, the just judge, looked and said, there's a punishment that has to be paid. The penalty of sin is death. I'm going to lay that punishment instead of on you, Spencer, right? Instead of on you, listener, right? I'm going to lay that sin on Christ, and I'm going to kill him. Right? I'm going to smite him. It is the will of the Father for him to die, right? To take your punishment. And when in him taking your sin, you're going to gain his righteousness. So how is simple. Christ dies and takes my sin. I gain his righteousness. Right? And death couldn't hold him because he was perfect. He knew no sin, 2 Corinthians 5:21. And so he rises from the dead, assuring me of life in heaven. But the question I want you to hear over the last 3 weeks is, who is Jesus? He's a humble servant doing the will of God to die for man. Why? Because we deserve death, and the only solution is his death. How? He takes my sin and he lays it on himself, and I gain his righteousness. And so that's sort of the reality of where we are, right? That my sin has put me at odds with God, and were it not for Christ, I'd remain at odds with God. And so through faith alone, I gain his righteousness. He gained my sin, and I am able to walk in the newness of life with Christ. Next week, we're going to talk about so what. So if all those things are true, what now? Right? So take a look. If you haven't looked at the past two, take a look at who Christ is, why he came. This is how he's able to make an impact on my life and change my life forever. And next week, we'll look at, so what does all this mean? Love you guys. Talk to you soon.